Hello everyone, welcome to the second webinar for CRC. This webinar is about to help you find the topics you should choose to research on. And with us today we have Taylor Myers, our speaker, and she will be today's webinar speaker. Can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi everyone, my name is Taylor Myers. I am a researcher at the Community College Research Center at Teachers College at Columbia University. I'm also a doctoral student in the Education Policy Program, and I specifically study higher education access and success, especially thinking about how community colleges and four-year colleges can organize themselves to support non-traditional students like returning adults, parenting students, first-generation students, how they can sort of close equity gaps and have more equitable outcomes like completion, retention, and job placement rates.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Yes, today's content we will have go through the brainstorming research process, and we also have some activities to help you brainstorm your idea for the topic as well. So yeah, I think we can get started right now. I will stop sharing my screen so that Taylor, you can start your presentation.
Sure, okay. So I will hit that. And let me just start from the beginning since this is in the middle. Sorry about that. You guys got a preview of everything to come. Okay, so as I said, this is me, Taylor Myers. This is my email address. Anyone is more than welcome to send me an email if you have any questions. After this presentation, I'm always happy to connect. I already told you a little bit about what I currently do and also what I'm studying, but also just wanted to give you a little bit of background about my research experience. So I actually found research as a profession after graduating from college and working at several education nonprofit organizations. And this definitely was not something that I was exposed to early on in my academic career. And it wasn't really until after I earned my master's degree in public policy that it really started to become clear how I could participate in research professionally. So it took probably a good 10 years from the time that I started college to working for me to really understand like how I could actually have a job as a researcher. So I say that just to inspire all of you who, like me, might have felt a little bit out of the loop at the beginning. I started as a first-generation college student out of high school, went on a scholarship to a four-year university, and I definitely remember feeling very overwhelmed. Like, what is this thing called research, and how does everybody seem to know how to get started in it and what to do, and why don't I know any of those things? So if anybody listening has felt that way, I can definitely empathize. And so today we are hopefully going to get everybody on a great standing and talk a little bit more in depth about the research process in social sciences and go through some exercises that will hopefully put you on track to choosing a research topic. And at the end, we will have some time for questions and answers, hopefully. So if anything, please feel free to jump in at any moment, but if you'd prefer, I'll make sure to hold time at the end in case anybody has any questions. So to get started, the first thing to know about social science research is that it looks quite similar to other research topic areas that you might have participated in or heard about, like the hard sciences or the humanities. And there are generally just three phases to any type of research. There's exploration, there's design, and there's implementation. And within those phases are probably where the difference between the sciences, the social sciences, humanities will be differentiated from each other and from other disciplines. Probably not the actual activities. Those pretty much follow the scientific method and aren't going to change, but each discipline puts their own emphasis on what's important and also the order that these types of things happen. So that's just to let you know that I'm going to be talking specifically about social science research and the elements of a research project or a study that follows more of a social science research process. All of these elements will probably be very similar from the hard sciences or the humanities, but they might be changed in order, they might be changed in importance. And specifically, we're going to focus today on the exploration phase of the social science research process. And even more specifically, we're going to talk a lot about developing the research question. Later on, I'll talk about the literature review and I'll talk about relevant theories and how to connect your work to relevant theories, but mostly we're going to be focusing on developing a research question. But just to preview, after you've sort of worked through all of those other, the first phase, the exploration phase, there are other elements of the research process, and you'll probably hear more about these in future talks. But after you've gone through all of the exploration steps, you'll next move to design. There you'll choose, that will give you a chance to choose a methodological strategy. So what is the actual strategy that you're going to use to implement your analysis? Planning for any type of data collection. That often involves a lot of relationship management. People are the key to your data, and you want to be very friendly. You catch a lot more bees with honey than you do with vinegar, and there's a lot of work that goes into defining your methodological strategy, connecting it back to your literature review, making sure that it's supported by your theoretical framework, but then also just getting your hands on the data that are going to help you actually implement your methods. You also in the design phase, you'll focus on gaining any necessary approval. So that's like the getting IRB approval, or establishing any type of data sharing agreements, or anything formal that might be required based on the information you're seeking. And then once you've explored your topic, strategized your study design, you're basically ready to implement at that point. That could look like conducting a pilot test, or depending on your time and your resources, you might move directly into collecting data and then analyzing and reporting your findings. So again, we're not really going to talk as much about these two design and implementation phases. We're really going to be focusing today on developing a research question. Okay. So generally, inspiration for research questions comes from two sources, either ideas that you think up or from data that you have available. The idea here is that most researchers either get an idea and then they search for the data to answer the question that will support what they're interested in, or they're just handed some data, or they have access to some data professionally or academically or through some other network, and then they have to develop an interesting question from what they have access to. There's not really a right way or a wrong way to begin here in terms of which direction you start with, but oftentimes we don't have complete control over where this starts. Either you're told the sky's the limit and you have go find a brilliant idea, come up with a brilliant idea, and then you have to sort of find the data and the information that are going to help you answer that question. Or, like I said, you're just kind of handed these data and you have to understand, are they valid? What are they telling you? How are they shaped? What kinds of questions can you ask with the data that are available to you? So if we start at the idea phase, going from idea to research question, then as you start brainstorming, you might want to ask yourself some questions that can kind of help help get your mind thinking and move your energy towards sort of a productive research question. One of the questions that I love to ask myself is, what problems do I see in the world that I want to know more about? So that can come from the news, that can come from listening to a podcast, that can come from talking to my friends or my family. But do I see problems in the world? Do I want to know more about them? And what can I do to help solve this problem through research? So I think that's a really good place to start when it comes to brainstorming, especially in the social sciences, which do tend to be focused on social issues or questions or problems. Another place to start thinking might be, think about, has anything that you've read or that you've listened to or that you've experienced, has it made you anxious or scared or excited, or has it in some way piqued your interest or given you some strong emotion? That can be a great place as you start to think about those moments in time where, or those experiences where that happened. That can be a great way to really hone your own interests and start to identify topic areas that really matter to you. So if they spark a strong emotion in you, that usually means that there's something about that that's interesting, and is there a research topic in there? So I would encourage you to explore that. Another way to think about it is, do you have professional goals that could steer you towards a specific topic? So for example, if you already know that you're looking at a career in clinical psychology or public policy, well, you might want to think about an issue, or you might want to think about asking your research question in a specific way that will set you up more professionally for those disciplines. So for example, you might read papers in a clinical psychology journal, or you might read papers in a public policy journal and kind of get familiar with the way that questions are asked, the type of sources that they use, you know, key literature, and that might steer you towards a research area, you know, if you know you have those specific professional goals in mind. Okay, so knowing that, what I want everyone to do is just take 3 minutes, and I want, within the context of this year's CRC theme, which is COVID-19, I want you to just jot down your own answers to any of the questions above. So I'll let you know when 3 minutes is up, but I really want to encourage you at this moment to think really big, think about what deeply interests you. Don't listen to any type of inner critic that says, no, that's not possible, I'll never be able to get my hands on that data, that's a stupid question. Don't listen to that. And also just be really creative. Okay, so I'm looking at the clock, and at 6:21, I will let everybody know to come back. Here, who would like to tell us how the brainstorming session went? Is there anything that really is super interesting to you?
Oh, there are a few people putting into the chat. I don't know if you can see it since you're
you know what?
sharing the screen.
I can't see the chat. If you wouldn't mind reading. Oh, here we go. Okay, this is great. Great, so I'll just mention a few. So one student is interested in the importance of socializing, especially young children. So how are elementary students impacted socially because of online school or no online school? Their mental health, I think that's an excellent one. Food distribution during COVID, the stock market, that's super interesting. A lockdown on economics, maybe is that local economics or national economics, global economics? That's a really interesting idea. The effects of COVID-19 and school closings on parents, yeah, that's definitely something that I'm thinking a lot about too. Online learning for college students, actually that's one that I am also, I'm really thinking about right now as well. I was kind of doing this exercise with you all, and some things that I came up with were sort of thinking about the resources necessary to be a successful online student. You know, it occurs to me that we need reliable internet, we need quiet surroundings, we need a safe environment, we need childcare, right? There are all of these things that are necessary to be successful as an online student, and how do you know, course outcomes or any other college outcome, how do those change based on differential access to these resources that we don't really think are you know, like college resources, but that really, you know, change the experience. So life after being laid off, yep, absolutely. So thinking about what that could mean psychologically, socially, developmentally. Yeah, there are a lot of professionally. So these are great. So I think you guys are really thinking about important and interesting questions. So I'm excited to see where they go. Okay, so first we talked about moving from idea to research. So remember, if we just want to go back to this slide really quickly. So with all of these awesome questions that you're asking, if you don't already have access to data that are going to help you answer a very specific question related to these topics, then that's going to be your next task. So you have the idea, you have the topic area, but now you need to have the data to support the type of question that you're going to ask. So that's sort of, I'm just trying to demonstrate the directionality of how you might go about getting yourself from idea to specific topic. A lot of it's going to still have to do with what data you actually have access to. But of course, you might already have access to data which could influence your question. So it kind of can go in the other direction. So if you already have either access to data or you're planning on using a publicly accessible data set, in addition to just making sure that you actually can access it technologically, so making sure that you have well, I was going to say Stata, but whatever, programming, whatever program or coding skills or whatever you need to access and manipulate the data. In addition to that, you also need to ask yourself some sort of fundamental questions about the information. So first, do you have access to it? What's required to gain access? What are the steps? Is it feasible? Can you do it in the right amount of time? Kind of think through that really carefully. But then also, what do you know about how the data are collected? Do you trust that they're valid? If you're using a publicly accessible data set that's coming from a state government or the federal government, there's probably not a whole lot to be too worried about, but if you do have questions about specific variables or how they're collected, or if you're using something like the census, which is sort of normalized across the population because it's representative of everyone, even though we know that not everyone, gives their information to the census, then you're going to also have to do research into the weights, how they weight each observation, how they weight different populations. There's just a lot to know about exactly what you're looking at. If you're sort of being given access to something that's more produced internally, that's not anybody from the general public would have access to it, you definitely want to ask those questions both internally to yourself and also make sure that you ask them professionally to anyone who's giving it to you. What is the validity of this data? Where does it come from? Who produces it? Where can I go if I have questions? Is there a definitions guidebook or what's called a data dictionary? There's just specific questions you might want to ask. You also want to look at how the data are organized. So that means you want to think about whether or not the observations are long or wide. Those are two really common ways that data are organized. An example of long data might be if you have multiple people, for example, and each person is in their own row, and then let's say you have multiple people who took classes. You have a line for every student and then every class they took, so that students will show up multiple times in the data set for every class that they took. That's an example of long data. You might also have wide data, which would be each student only gets one line across, and there are different indicators for the types of courses that a student took. So sometimes the way the data are shaped, which sometimes you can reshape it, but it might also influence the way that you ask your question. So you might want to look into that before you sort of solidify exactly the question that you're asking, so that your question can be answered with the information that's provided to you. And that kind of leads into number 4. What kinds of questions can you ask with the data that you have? So there are 3 key types of data that I want to, and you'll talk a lot more in detail about this in future talks, but I just wanted to sort of bring this up as a precursor to that. So there's panel data, which means time series, or sorry, it's also called time series. And what that means is generally the same variables, usually for the same people or the same states or the same cities or whatever your ID for those data are measured over time. So for example, if you have data on states and you're looking at population every year, that is time series data, and the panel are states. Sometimes, but not always, they focus, especially if they're individuals, they focus on the same variables over time, but the actual population of people might change. So you want to, kind of think about how that would influence your questions. There's also cross-sectional data. Cross-sectional data is more of a snapshot in time. So that is not necessarily going to be the same people or the same variables each year. It's only going to allow you to see, what happened at this time when the data were collected. That's totally fine. You don't need time series data to ask a lot of really interesting questions. And the cool thing about cross-sectional data is that it often includes both qualitative and quantitative observations or measures. So you can kind of mix and match your questions. And then there's also qualitative data. This might come from interviews, like, for example, transcripts of interviews that somebody conducted as part of a study, or even texts that are scraped off of lines. Some of the most interesting research that I've been working on, we're actually scraping college catalogs to analyze the types of courses that are offered in different terms. And it's been really cool to use the Wayback Machine, to kind of get these snapshots of college websites over time and scrape the text and see how colleges have changed their messaging to students. So even though it's qualitative data, we can still ask really interesting questions about it. There are also ethnographies or observational studies. Those often include a researcher or a group of researchers following one group or a few groups of comparative people, or usually people, but it could be other types of observations, for an extended period of time, and then writing down their observations. So there are a lot of different types of data that you can collect to answer your question. Again, you'll get into this in future talks, but I just kind of wanted to bring this to your attention as you're thinking about your question so that you can understand the relationship between the question and the data. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is the difference between asking a causal question and asking a descriptive question. So descriptive questions are probably more familiar to everyone. Generally, it describes a measure. It describes and measures a relationship between, two or more variables. So, for example, is pandemic burnout more prevalent among male or female parents? I'm not actually, in that question, I'm not asking, does gender cause a different response to burnout? I'm only asking about the association between gender and pandemic burnout. Another one might be, how has the pandemic impacted youth voting behaviors? Again, I'm not saying that the pandemic caused changes in youth voting behaviors, because that would be a causal question. I'm just asking about the association between the two. And just because it's not causal doesn't mean it's invalid in any way, shape, or form. It's just, it's really important in the social sciences that you clarify whether or not you're asking something descriptively and talking about associations, which can absolutely be quantitative if that's what you're interested in, or they can be qualitative. Otherwise, if you want to ask a causal question, which is more experimental, that requires slightly stricter standards, quite frankly, when it comes to statistical inference. So in this case, a causal question tests whether a causal relationship between two or more variables exists. So we're asking specifically, for example, does remote work cause lower wages? There I was thinking about people moving from major cities, major metropolises to, more rural areas. Are firms lowering wages, giving people lower cost of living, assessments and thus lowering their wages, something like that. Or does increased sanitization cause more non-COVID illnesses? Like, are we reducing our immunity to, cold and other bacteria and stuff like that? Those are just a few examples to sort of demonstrate the difference. But I will say in the social sciences, when you read papers, it's important to ask yourself, are they asking a descriptive question or a causal question? Because if they're asking a causal question, you'll need much more, you'll be held to a higher standard when it comes to your statistical inference, because you'll have to show that your experiment was essentially as good as a randomized control trial. And there are a lot of ways to do that in the social sciences, but it is a little bit more mathematically rigorous than a descriptive question. Again, future talks will get into that, but I just wanted to sort of lay the groundwork there. And of course, if you have questions, please feel free to ask me. Okay, so knowing all of that, what makes a good research question? Regardless of your topic, regardless of your data, really your question can be anything within the bounds of your project or your challenge or your job or whatever you're being asked to do. But always, good research questions should first have a clear goal that readers can understand. The reader should know exactly the question you're asking and the problem you're trying to understand when they read your abstract, when they read your paper. So it's really important to make sure that the study that you design is well connected and clearly articulated to the goal of your project. The second thing that a research question should always have is focus. So a good question to ask yourself is my question focused on a problem that can be addressed by my research? So especially in the social sciences, which are, like I said, often tied to social problems or social issues, or just social phenomena, it's really important that your question is that the question that you're asking is focused on a problem that actually could be solved or supported or aided or helped, whatever it is, by your question. So for example, if you wanted to study like the effects of COVID-19 and school closings on parents, it's important that the question you end up asking, the research question you end up asking, can actually support any problems you end up identifying as part of that study. So it wouldn't really help to kind of go off on a tangent and start studying like early, access to transportation and early childcare, literacy, differences in, urbanicity. Like if you kind of start to add too much to your question and it'll get really muddled, it's not clearly focused on a problem that can actually be addressed by your research. The last thing is execution and follow through. So a good research question can be appropriately addressed in a given timeline with the resources that you have. So based on your own knowledge, your own skills that you want to develop, this is also a learning opportunity, but based on sort of your internal resources, based on the time that you have and the scope of the project or the scope of the challenge, are you able to complete the research project? That doesn't necessarily mean you have to have some brilliant, amazing finding. I mean, 90% of research is just saying, hey, we actually didn't find something here. And it's important to know that. That's totally fine and totally appropriate. But you want to make sure that you'll at least be able to get to some answer within the time and resource constraints that you face. So before I move on to any activities, are there any questions? Feel free to ask out loud or put in the chat. I'll try to answer. Okay, well, it doesn't sound like anybody has any questions right now, but keep them written down, and I will make sure that we save time at the end. Okay, so we might not actually need 5 minutes for this, might just shorten it a little bit, but I want to give everyone a little bit of individual brainstorm time, and then we're gonna break out into groups and work on a group exercise together based on the brainstorm time, the work that you're about to do. So I want you to think about the topic area that interests you. Think about what you've heard or seen or experienced regarding COVID-19 that you want to know more about. I know we already kind of went through that piece of it. But then ask yourself, are you focused on a quantitative question? Are you focused on a qualitative question? Do you want to ask a descriptive question or a causal question? Then I want you to start thinking, you don't have to have an answer to this, but kind of start putting the pieces in place of what kinds of data and information do you have access to, or do you think you would want access to? Based on the question you want to ask, how are you going to get there? I'm just sort of asking you to think towards the future about how you might start getting towards designing a study. And also, don't forget the awesome skills and knowledge that you already possess, or like I said, that you want to develop through this process. So if there are specific skills, like if you know you've never done a quantitative paper in your life, but you want to learn Python, or you want to learn how to code in Stata or R to do data analysis, and now is the time, great. If that's a goal of yours, wrap it into the question. That's totally appropriate here. So we'll do 3 minutes. I'll call everyone back, and then we will move on to the group exercise. If anybody has any questions about, these topics, what I asked, or does anybody have any cool ideas that they want to share? It might be helpful for others to hear about how you are approaching, either you already have a research project and you can answer these questions easily, or you're sort of thinking through it. I think it's always helpful to hear from your peers. There's a question about how specific the question should be. I think that's a really good question. In general, it should be fair, I would say pretty specific. So for example, if I'm just going to kind of pull one of these, food distribution during COVID. I think that's an excellent one. So I think they're all excellent, but I'm just pulling one. So food distribution during COVID is too broad for a research study. It's totally fine as the name of your study, but as you think about the actual data that you're going to use, as you think about the specific methodology that you're going to employ to answer your question, like what specific question do you have about food distribution during COVID? So, are you interested in how I don't know, like food distribution centers are reallocating resources based on the funding that they received from the federal government during COVID? That, I think, is a more appropriate question for the type of research project that you're being asked to do. It's a little bit more focused. It's a little bit more narrow. You can identify maybe a few distribution centers that you want to, hone in on. You could get even more specific and say, community engagement, how have community engagement strategies among food distribution centers changed during COVID? And then again, in your abstract or in your study, you might only have 1 or 2 communities that you're looking at as a case study, and that's totally okay. But if you just kind of leave it at food distribution during COVID, it's not quite specific enough for you to get your hands on some data and to ask a question that is actually, pushing social science forward, if that makes sense. And I didn't mean to pick on that one. I think it's an excellent question. I'm just trying to give an example of how I might tailor it into a research question that you can actually focus on for the scope of this project. There's another question about doing research. Is doing research projects something that you can add on LinkedIn? 100% yes. So participating in this program, doing challenges like this, if there's any type of publication, policy brief, paper, conference presentation, anything that comes out of this work, 100% you can put it on LinkedIn, you can put it on your resume. This is why you should be doing this kind of stuff. I definitely wasn't doing it as early college student, and I definitely wish that I had been more focused on that. I think it would have been really helpful.
Hello?
Yes?
Yeah, I got a question. So I just told you that I want to do about the effects of COVID or online learning on parents.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I actually think of maybe I would do sociology or psychology,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm thinking what type of sociology questions can I ask about this topic?
Yeah, so if you're stuck, if you have a topic that sort of can bleed into multiple disciplines, and honestly, a lot of questions can. That's why they're good and interesting questions. It might help to sort of think about, which we're going to talk about in a minute, sort of the literature and the theory that you want to employ, and also the methods. So the methods the type of question you want to ask, for example, psychology might be focused more on an individual's sort of mental or processing experience. If that's the type of question that you're interested in, like somebody's own social or psychological or academic behavior, then it might be more appropriate to employ a method that is typical for psychology. If what you're interested in is inequality or differences between groups of people or differences between types of sociological experiences, so does one group of people experience something in the same way that another group experiences it, then that's probably more sociology. So you kind of want to, I would say, lean on the literature and lean on the theories that belong to each of these disciplines to help you narrow your question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're more than welcome. Okay, so let's move on to the group activity. So and I will definitely need Jasmine's help for that part. But before we do that, we're going to spend about 10 minutes in your group, but I wanted to introduce you to what I call the research elevator pitch. And this is actually something that I had to do for my own dissertation as we're thinking about our topics. So, this is definitely something, if you continue in research, you will see again. I think it would be really helpful. It would have been a really helpful exercise for someone like me to have done several years ago, but I nonetheless still use it, and I wanted to introduce you all to it. So, okay, one way to think about, to sort of narrow your question and think about the type of research you want to do, types of questions you want to ask, is to fill out this Mad Lib, essentially, which, so for example, I am any kind of action verb related to your research. So I am studying, for example, some research topic because I want to find out some question in order to better understand. This is more about like the motivation behind your question, so that we'll know more about or be able to determine something. So if you can sort of fill out this Mad Lib, it will help push you towards a direction for being able to not only conduct your research, but also to explain your research to others. And that's a really big part of doing research, is telling other people what you're doing. Either you're writing it in an abstract, or you are talking to a recruiter, or you're talking to your advisor. These are really important conversations that you're going to have. So I actually made an example. Okay, So for example, I am investigating. So remember, that verb that you choose will tell people whether or not you're asking a causal question or a descriptive question. So here I'm not actually asking a causal question. So I'm not trying to decide if something causes something else. I'm just investigating a relationship. I am investigating the relationship between gender and feelings of burnout during COVID-19 because I want to find out if gender influences reactions to environmental stress in order to better understand how gender roles impact families under environmental stress. So first, I'm talking specifically about, I'm studying sort of gender influence, how gender influences reactions to environmental stress. But I'm really studying that because I want to find out more about family, gender roles and family and stress. So I'm kind of tying two theories together so that we'll know more about or be able to determine how to improve gender equity within families and prepare for future environmental events. So this is just an example. It's not perfect, but it does set me in the direction towards a sociological experiment that looks at the dynamics between family and gender and environmental stress, such as a global pandemic. So what I'm going to ask you to do is go into breakout groups. I think Jasmine should be able to put you into random groups. And I want you to work together. You don't have to work on one elevator pitch. You can work on your own. But I want you guys to be able to interact. So your goal at the end is to have an elevator pitch. It's okay if it's not complete, but work with your peers, see what they're working on, see how they're phrasing things, and just kind of brainstorm together to make your own elevator pitches. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Oops, I went too far. Okay, I went way too far. Here we go. So, Jasmine, if you wouldn't mind putting everybody into breakout groups for a few minutes. So thank you for folks who are just now joining us. I was just going to ask if anybody had, any insights or things that they wanted to share from talking to their peers. Like, did it help you sort of focus your question at all? Do you still have questions?
I think that helped a lot because we were kind of like able to talk to each other and listen to each other's ideas and kind of like work together if we had any questions.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, so I mean, that's also just part of the research process is, before COVID, before I was working in my house, I sat in a little cubicle with a lot of other doctoral students, and you could kind of just lean your head over and say, like, hey, what do you think about this idea? And somebody would be like, nope, there's already 25 papers, don't bother, or somebody would say, oh, that's really interesting. Like, how would you do it? And then you got to think like, oh yeah, how would I do it? So I encourage you guys to talk to as many people who will listen as possible to your research ideas. My family is super tired of hearing mine, I can tell you that. But that's okay, because I just need the practice saying it out loud, because you always kind of catch yourself and you have new questions. So I hope that was helpful. Okay, we have another question. Are there necessary skills we should have that would be helpful for research, like Excel? Great question. I would say to some extent, yes, but also research is the opportunity to build those skills. I don't think that there are like absolute precursors that if you don't have it, you can't do research. I don't think that that's true. But I think that if you're thinking about collecting or looking at any type of quantitative data, or if you're thinking about collecting qualitative data and then analyzing it in a way that will give you some quantitative insights, so like I was talking about with the text, scraping text, like, how many times does this word show up or things like that, I do think it's helpful to to start building some proficiency with Excel, but also with statistical programming. So R is a free and open source statistical programming language. There are a ton of resources online. There are a lot of getting started tutorials. You know, and you can get started with extremely simple data sets of just, you know, 30 observations, and you can kind of manipulate it. But you could also do extremely complex things with R, and it's just a really great skill to have. In a similar vein, you can develop your skills in Stata. Stata is you have to pay for Stata. It's another statistical processing language, and it does very similar things to R, but you might not have access to it through your university, but you might also not, and so the downside is you'd have to pay for it, and it can be quite expensive. So either way, I think that Excel is a great place to start. Gain some fluency with Excel, move on to some statistical programming language. I think it will be super helpful in the future. Otherwise, I think just skills in terms of, I know it's a really long answer, I'm sorry, but just skills of like how to ask a question, how to talk about your research, like understanding the relationship between the data and the question. Like these types of concepts are super important, and the more that you get familiar with kind of thinking through the challenges that the questions I'm posing can bring up, I think the easier it will be for you to have a conversation moving forward about, you know, where do you want to transfer? What do you want to graduate in? What kind of job do you want? Like these are the types of professional conversations you'll have. So I think that they're also a skill. There are a few more questions coming in, but I actually want to save them for the end and go back and share my screen because I have a few more concepts I want to go over, and then I'll come back to these questions. So keep typing them as you have them, and I'll come back. Okay. So I'm going to. Okay, so hopefully everyone is able to see that. So this is the activity that we just worked on. This is just sort of a reminder of where we've come. So we talked about the social science research process, and we've really focused on this develop a research question part of the exploration phase. And I want to focus on the literature review and also connecting your question to theory, especially because I know that you have an abstract coming up, and a really key part of that abstract is going to be making sure that your question is grounded in literature and also in theory. So what does that mean? So the literature review, it essentially frames your topic within the context of other work. So for example, other studies that have been done on a similar topic that you are studying. What methods did they use? What were their findings? What was great about their finding, or what made sense about their methods, and what didn't make sense about their methods? You want to sort of build the context for your study by leaning on other studies that have already been done. That's sort of just best practice. So the first thing to know is that you want to use literature that's appropriate for your genre. But you also shouldn't be afraid to lean on other disciplines. And what I mean by that is if you're asking a sociological question or an economic question, primarily you want to use studies that are also looking at a problem from a sociological standpoint or an economic standpoint, a psychology standpoint. It will just help give you a little bit more guidance and narrow that down the context for your question. But that doesn't mean that other studies in other disciplines don't also have interesting implications. So if you're asking a question about economics, but you're interested in the economic inequalities of something, you might want to lean on some sociological research, because you might want to think about not only what are the sort of economic implications of this, but what are the social implications of this, and other disciplines might help you answer that. So the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to use the literature review to just regurgitate other findings. When you write your abstract, you don't want your literature to review to just be Davis 2011 found this, and Simons 2006 found this, and who cares, who cares, who cares? Like, if it's not connected to, if you don't connect the literature, each study to each other, and then also don't connect it back to your question, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And it's not clear to the reader why you are talking about it. So you want to make sure that that when you're writing your literature review, you're not just saying so-and-so found this thing, but based on the findings that so-and-so found, I believe that the implications for my study are 1, 2, and 3. And this was, supported by another study that found X, Y, Z. So you can kind of think about connecting the literature that you find in a narrative form, making sure that all the ideas blend together rather than just regurgitating the findings, which is not really helpful for telling anybody like why you're bringing up that study. Yeah, and then use existing literature to practice framing your question within the bounds of your chosen discipline. What I mean by that is if you read certain journals like that are focused on economics or that are focused on psychology or focused on sociology, you'll find, or focused on political science, just not to leave it out, you'll find that there's certain, there's lingo, there's differences in the way that questions are asked, there's differences in sort of the assumptions that are made. There's just slight, once you're in the biz, once you're in that field, everybody just assumes, I'm not saying that it should be this way, I'm just kind of saying that it is. Everyone assumes that we're all kind of speaking the same language and we're, working on problems in a similar way. That's why it's its own discipline. So if you're interested in practicing framing a question or engaging in that discipline, then the literature can really help you do that, because you can find examples of other ways that people talk about this problem or, focus their research or ask their question, things like that. Okay, I'm not going to go through everything on this slide, but I think that Jasmine has a copy of these, and so it would be awesome if somebody from CRC could share this with folks. These are top journals within each of the disciplines for the research challenge. So they're mostly available online. A lot of them you should be able to access through colleges and universities or public libraries. The Annual Review of Sociology, the Journal of Politics, NBER working papers, Psychological Review. These are all really common world-class journals that people publish their studies in. So if you're looking for examples of other studies within these disciplines, I would absolutely start here. It will also help you build your literature review for your own topic. And the easiest way to do this is just Google Scholar. I use Google Scholar all the time. Search something about my topic, search a journal, see what pops up. Some other great key sources for social science, and a lot of these places also have publicly accessible data. So the Brookings Institute, Urban Institute, the RAND Corporation, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, Center for American Progress, the American Enterprise Institute. If you Google these organizations, you'll see that they produce their own papers, which can be really helpful to understand how they think about these problems. But they also oftentimes publish accessible data that you can download and do your own analysis on. Okay, so I wanted to talk about connecting your research question to theory. And this is a little bit tricky. This is actually something that we are taught in doctoral dissertation programs. So this isn't something, if you've never heard of it, I don't want you to be like, oh my gosh, what am I missing? You're not missing anything. This is hard, but it's really important. So theory helps guide your research design and guide your methodology. It's also a really important part of your research abstract. So what I mean by that is within each discipline, there's going to be specific theories. So continuing on my example of the gender differences between environmental stress within families, within sociology, there is something called family theory. That means that like there are phenomenon that people study about families that happen consistently. There's also within sociology gender theory. Again, it's like consistent themes that come up over and over again among genders that have sort of have been built by academic researchers into their own theories. There's also theories within psychology about stress and people's responses and reactions to stress. So in this example, my research question is here in the middle, gender differences in stress responses during COVID-19. I should say my research topic. This is a little too broad for a question. And then I'm building a theoretical framework, which is this entire shape, by saying, okay, to answer my question here, I'm going to lean on family theory, I'm going to lean on gender theory, and I'm going to lean on psychology of stress, theories that explain psychology of stress. Okay? And when you write your abstract, that's kind of how you want to think about it. Like, what exists in my discipline theoretically that might help explain why I'm seeing this problem? So the first thing to do is research prevalent theories within your chosen discipline. So again, like if you're interested in economics, what are, specific microeconomic theories that you are, like supply and demand, for example, that you really want to lean on that will help you answer your question. And then use what you learn about theory and also use what you've learned from the literature to develop a theoretical framework for your study. So this triangle here is my theoretical framework. It can be a lot more complicated than this. It doesn't have to be more complicated, but this is just an example. Your theoretical framework should be novel, and it should build off existing theory in your discipline. So my theoretical framework is saying, hey, if I pull these ideas from family theory, and if I pull these ideas from gender theory, and I combine them with these ideas of the psychology of stress, I think that I can explain some of what's happening in this thing that I'm seeing or observing, which is gender differences in stress responses within families during COVID-19. So that kind of demonstrates how I tie all, existing ideas and existing theories into my own novel idea. And your research question should be your own novel idea, but it can lean on all of these other existing theories. And then finally, your theoretical framework should help explain why the problem you're researching exists. So if I'm observing this weird thing where men and women respond to stress differently, and that impacts family dynamics, well, how can all of these existing theories help me explain what I'm seeing? And if you can answer these last two questions, or if you can sort of build your theoretical framework off these last 2 points, that is your abstract. Like that's the meat and potatoes of your abstract. The rest of it is just your study design, your literature, and you're kind of building off of that. Again, it's a little bit complicated, but I think as you start to read a few papers, make sure you check out some papers from these sources. You'll become a little bit more comfortable with the type of language and how people lean on certain theories. Okay, so that is all I have. I am going to stop sharing my screen and start answering your questions. So one question we had was, with descriptive questions, should the conclusion be something along the lines of there's a positive or negative relationship between X and Y? Maybe. It doesn't have to be. The conclusion could be something along the lines of, in this context, we observe X and Y happening. In this context, we don't observe that happening, and here's why we think that is. Yeah, it can, especially with qualitative, it's more important to establish what your question is trying to answer and then try to answer that question. So it doesn't necessarily have to be there's a positive or negative relationship. It could be X affects Y in this way. Can you give us some effective ways to find the group mates to work with? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think one thing to think about might be if you, okay, so I think there are two ways to approach this. One is you're really dead set on a topic and you're looking for group mates who are also interested in that topic so that you can, really focus in on that area. I would, I would, that's one way, and maybe reach out to everyone and say, hey, I really want to do this thing. Does anybody else want to do this thing with me? The other way is to say, I'm actually just interested in the research experience and I'm kind of ambivalent about the question. I really just want to get my hands dirty with asking a question and manipulating some data and coming up with an answer. In that case, I would do the opposite. You just kind of say, hey, does anybody have a question? Are you looking for other people to join your group? Here are my skills. Here are my interests. I think it's always helpful to just be upfront with what you have and what you want. Those would be my recommendations. Another question is, how can you pull data from different countries? That's a really good question. I mostly focus my research domestically, so I don't have a lot of experience with data from other countries, but I would start with world organizations. If you have one country in mind, I would go to national sources in that country. If you're interested in comparing countries, I might start with something like the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the UN, or another global organization that might have data, International Rescue Committee, that might have data on different countries. Don't think tanks carry some bias or lean towards their agenda? For sure, you're going to find that there are very progressive leaning think tanks, there are very conservative leaning think tanks. The ones I chose tend to be a little bit more in the middle. A few of them, like American Enterprise Institute, leans a little bit to the right. CAP, Center for American Progress, leans a little bit more to the left. But in general, like the GAO is nonpartisan. RAND tends to be very center. Brookings can kind of swing either way. It's a little bit more in the middle, but sometimes it has an opinion. Urban Institute can sometimes be a little to the left. It really just depends. You definitely want to be cognizant of those biases, but I would say if you're looking for applications of research that bleed into policy, I would just look at a wide swath of those think tanks and what products they're producing. If you're looking for data, they're generally not going to be biased. Those are all really solid national organizations that do a great job collecting data, and you'll be able to tailor your question based on what they have available without worrying about bias. So we have a few minutes left if we have any other questions.
So we are having a few minutes left. I will add a link for people who joining today. Feel free to fill out this attendance form, and if you attend all of the webinars, we will give you a certificate for your participation. And thank you for that. I leave the link into the chat.
But what if I missed the first seminar? Because last time I was busy and I didn't attend the.
In that case, you can just check our recording on YouTube.
Yeah, I did, but does it count if I want to get a certificate of participation?
I would say it won't be counted since you missed the first one. But if you join CRC, then you will get another type of certificate as well.
Okay, thank you.
There's a student asking for the links to the videos.
Yes, I will give it shortly. Okay. I also have the CRC website and Discord server, so feel free to join our Discord. It's like a small group, but you can seek help immediately in that group. So feel free to join us.
Great. Well, I had a lot of fun talking to everyone. I hope that it was helpful.
This isn't a question, but thank you so much, Taylor, for coming here and speaking. It was super informative, and just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, you're more than welcome. My email address is at the top of the slide, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank
Um,
you.
Taylor, do you mind type your email into the chat
Sure,
box
we do.
so that people can have access to it immediately? I also shared the College Leap YouTube. There will be the recording uploaded for the webinar. And you also have Taylor's email, so feel free to ask her about your research. And thank you, Taylor, for putting that in.
Yeah, you're more than welcome.
Yes, if there is no question left, I think we can end the webinar right here. And thank you everyone so much for your participation. I hope the webinar is helpful for you guys. And we will be having the third webinar coming up next Friday as well. So please check out for that on our website. Thank you, Taylor, for hosting today's webinar. It's such an informative section.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So good luck on everyone's research projects. I'm excited to see what everyone comes up with.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good night.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.